officially welcome everyone to our event tonight. We are so excited to be celebrating what would have been primary election night here in the state of Kentucky with some of our wonderful political science professors. So I'm going to start the event by introducing our main host for the evening, and that is Dr. Jasmine Farrier. Jasmine is a professor and proud chair of the Department of Political Science at UofL. Jasmine grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and earned a BA in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She completed her PhD in government in 2000 from the University of Texas at Austin. She was a research fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center of Public Affairs from 2000 to 2001. Farrier joined the Department of Political Science at the University of Louisville in 2002. I happen to have been in one of her classes her first semester, very proud of that. Her current courses and research span all three branches of the U.S. government. She is the author of 3 books. The most recent is Constitutional Dysfunction on Trial, Congressional Lawsuits, and the Separation of Powers from Cornell University Press. So I will drop Jasmine's bio into the chat so everyone can have her contact information as well as a link to her book. But with that, Dr. Farrier, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and really a big thank you from your home Department of Political Science for putting on this event. Hello to everybody out there, and especially to my colleague, Adam Enders. Adam grew up in Shelby Township, Michigan, and earned his BA in Political Science and Public Policy from Albion College in 2011. Professor Enders completed his PhD in Political Science from Michigan State University in 2016, where he stayed on as an instructor for another academic year. He joined the Department of Political Science at the University of Louisville in 2017. Adam's research focuses on 3 main topics: conspiracy beliefs, political polarization, and the measurement of racial prejudice. His publications include over 15 academic journals and book chapters in the most prestigious outlets in his subfield of political behavior. His work also appears in popular outlets, including most recently The Atlantic and The Washington Post. We will give you those links throughout the program. Professor Enders is also an in-demand methodologist and teaches the next generation of political scientists, both in the United States and around the world, in 2 summer programs: Quantitative Methods of Social Research at the University of Michigan and Global School for Empirical Research Methods at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. Adam Enders has received several awards and public recognition for teaching, research, and professional service, most recently the Victor Olorunsola Endowed Research Award from the College of Arts and Sciences just this past spring semester. In his short 3 years at UofL, Adam has developed 5 courses and a reputation as a popular and rigorous instructor, and I think some of his students here today would attest to that. He teaches 2 classes in our MA program, Data Analysis and American Politics, and 3 courses for our undergraduate program, including Public Opinion, American Parties and Elections, and the Introductory Course to American Government and Politics. Adam, it's a thrill to have you here. I want to thank you for coming, and again, thanks to Marianne and to Amanda LeDuc, the Political Science Coordinator, who organizes all things to shout out the good news.
Thank you. That was very generous, and thanks to you all for putting this on, and I'm excited and happy to do it.
Great. Well, Adam and I are going to have a discussion, then we will discuss a few questions that I will prompt in a few seconds, and then we'll go on to some of the pre-submitted questions that we had a chance to look at, and they're very good. So let's just jump into it, Adam. Tell us a bit more about your background and how you chose your college and your major, why you wanted to be an academic, and did you know what you wanted to study when you went to graduate school, or did you find that path through mentors, events at the time, or some other inspirations? Tell us more about you.
Okay, so my story is, I think, not really very interesting, but a lot of professors think that, and it can be useful to sort of like talk about that a little bit with students who, you know, feel like they don't know exactly what they want to do or what they should do and whatever. So I was a first-gen college student. My parents didn't go to college, didn't have a ton of advice on how to navigate all that. So I just kind of figured it out. I went to a small liberal arts college because I was comfortable at a smaller place. And I sort of started off interested for some reason or another in environmental policy. So I took all of these policy courses and environmental microeconomics and stuff like that, until at some point I took a media and politics class with the person who would become my uh, uh, greatest sort of mentor in undergrad and my thesis advisor. And I just clicked with him, and he saw the world in a way that I kind of saw it, but I didn't know other people thought about that. I didn't know people studied that. And he was different than all the other political scientists at the university, and many of the social scientists for that matter. So I just sort of glommed onto him, and he sort of shepherded me through an undergraduate thesis and taking a first stab at figuring out how to do research. Told me on many occasions that I shouldn't go to graduate school, like a good professor should do, given the job market and other kinds of considerations. But I ended up going to Michigan State for political science. I actually was interested in media and politics, so I applied to a lot of communications programs too. I ended up thinking that political science and the program at MSU was the best fit for me, so I went. Didn't really do much media and politics stuff after that, but you just kind of get interested in some of the things that people around you are interested in, and glom onto them. And I can't say that anybody there was studying conspiracy beliefs at the time. And my advisor definitely thought that I was crazy for doing that. And that I was going to be branded as a weirdo or something going forward, and good luck getting a job with that. But it's sort of been a happy accident. It worked out well.
Wonderful. So I do think that people in the audience are always curious how professors become professors, and I think your path is very interesting, and you might get some questions about that. Let's go now into how you do your work, and I'll take a minute just to explain this to everybody who's out there. Some of you are current or future political science majors, some were political science majors, and some may not know a lot about how social science research is done. So here's the long windup. Political science has no native methodology, meaning there is nothing that automatically binds all political scientists together to look at the world and look at research tools the same way. We all borrow from other fields. So Adam Enders borrows from, his field is political behavior, which borrows heavily from psychology and sociology. So to give you a contrast, my own work borrows heavily from history and law. And we have colleagues who borrow from literature, communication, philosophy, economics, and other fields. So back to Adam, since you're a borrower, because we're all borrowers, why do you think psychology in particular offers frameworks and research tools that are relevant to political science today? Like other areas, political science has its fads, and political behavior really exploded in popularity in the 50s and 60s, and then it receded, and now it seems to be back. So can you tell us about the draw of being a political behavioralist today? And again, what you see in psychology that is relevant to studying politics.
Yeah, and that explosion of political behavior and political science also happened to have coincided with the explosion of social psychology programs in universities across the United States. So, and some of the earliest political scientists that we now would call, behavioralists were trained in social psychology programs. So, I think the whole idea behind that was these ideas that people had previously been wedded to, especially an Enlightenment style rationality where we're sort of cold, calculating beings, and we always do what's in our, material and economic self-interest, didn't hold any weight. So people started really thinking, well, okay, this is clearly wrong. There have to be some other sort of answers, some other causes behind the types of behaviors that we do observe. For me, I want to echo what you said. I say this to students all the time, and I really think that this is one of the reasons that I sort of fell in love with political science. It's one of the reasons why I'm a political scientist and not a psychologist, is because we are aggregators, we are borrowers in your language, and we're interested in these sort of normative problems. We're interested in value problems. We're interested in, solving sort of like inequality or mitigating it, and thinking about how to sort of construct the best, kinds of policies on whatever dimension. And some other social scientific disciplines are, and psychology is one of these from my view, not to bash any psychologists that might be listening, that just they don't concentrate on that very much, right? If you read psychology papers, it's sort of, some other people did this, a logical extension of that is this, Y, so therefore we're going to do Y, and that's the wind up, right? And the conclusion is basically, well, we found X, Y, and Z in the end. With political science, we're always, when we're trading each other's work, when we're at conferences, when we're submitting papers for peer review, the question that gets asked the most, I have to imagine, is, so what, right? What does this really matter? So yeah, I view political science as borrowing. We take what psychologists know and what communications researchers know and what historians know, and we bundle that all together to try and make sense out of the world, but toward these particular goals that we're all interested in. Why I do psychology, why I picked that. I was always just sort of interested in people's beliefs. I don't think that I could point to any particular aha moment or some well thought out design that led me to that. But I do believe that if you actually understand people's motivations, and my work is, I think, a great example of that, even motivations behind seemingly wacky, bizarre kind of ideas, then you know a lot about why people are doing what they do, how to interact with them, and sort of, how to deal with them, right? Strategic interactions are at the center of basically all of political science. So it seems to me if that's the case, then psychology is probably pretty important.
Thank you for that insight. And now to the main question that I know that people are most interested in, which is about how to study conspiracy theory in general. So before we get to your current work on specific conspiracies, this seems like a particularly thorny subject. Mm-hmm. So they've been around for a long time. Conspiracy theories were not invented recently. You've done some preliminary work on COVID-19 related conspiracy theories, but tell us how these projects came together quickly, and how are these conspiracy theories both similar to and different from extant theories that you've studied before this current crisis?
Yeah, so even defining conspiracy theory is actually an epistemological issue.
Okay, well, let's start there. I mean, first, you might even tell us what's the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory, and then go from there.
Okay, so a conspiracy is a conspiracy theory that happened, right? So what's a conspiracy theory, right? We have conspiracy to commit murder. This idea of conspiracy is sort of in the legal vernacular, right? What's a conspiracy theory? It's a couple of different sort of elements that are usually present. So there is some clandestine, nefarious, usually small group of individuals that are working against the rest of us, right? Who us is, or who the people are, whatever is sort of, doesn't matter. For sort of nefarious, malevolent ends, right? So there are conspirators, there's a goal, there's motive, and that sort of sets it apart from skepticism, right? So skepticism would imply that you're sort of wedded to logic, and that your beliefs could be overturned if evidence satisfies some even-handed burden of proof, right? You believe in sort of logic and the scientific method and things like this. So conspiracy theories have those kind of basic elements, and for the most part, we talk about conspiracy theories as conspiracy theories and not conspiracies until we have overwhelming evidence that that's the case, which might not sound that satisfying, but it's sort of like saying, it's like arguing about a hypothesis, right? Hypotheses could be silly, they could be obvious, they could be somewhere in between where they seem reasonable. The question is, do we actually have some sort of evidence for this or not? And I just say one other thing about this. I don't really like the term conspiracy theorist very much because it has way too much baggage. And it also sort of dichotomizes the world, right? We have conspiracy theorists and we have non-conspiracy theorists. The way that I think about it and the way that some other political scientists and psychologists think about it is we're all kind of oriented along a continuum, which, you know, to people that do like measurement stuff, everything's a continuum basically, right? And at the high end, we have people that are predisposed to believe in these kinds of things. At the low end, we have people that are not very predisposed to believe in these things. And most people are somewhere in between, right? So it's not useful sort of drawing a line in the sand about what's crazy and what's not, and who's, you know, this tinfoil-hatted loon in their mom's basement and who's not. And I think the reality is also that if you're really low on this idea of sort of conspiratorial thinking, then that might actually be just as problematic as being really high. You might sort of uncritically accept lots of things and believe that politicians don't need to be monitored and that they're always telling the truth. Most of us would think that's just about as crazy as the opposite end. So anyway, that stuff aside, your question was about how I actually do this research.
Yes. What are the scientific protocols specifically by using public opinion and experimentation and other forms of replicable social science in a traditional sense and that's the title of this discussion is, how do you have a scientific study of an unscientific phenomenon?
Right. So as somebody that tackles this from the perspective of psychology and public opinion, I mostly do this in a survey kind of environment. So we construct questions where we ask people, there's a number of different ways we do it. We ask people to sort of double down on something and tell us, yes, I believe this, or I believe some version of this. Or sometimes we allow people to sort of tell us to what extent they sort of believe in this, sort of like the strongly disagree to strongly agree, where there's a little bit of variability there. We find that that doesn't actually matter that much, interestingly. So maybe the learned folks that are, you know, interested enough to spend an evening listening to me would think that, you know, what kind of person would actually say that they have these kinds of beliefs out loud to somebody, even if it's an anonymous interviewer or you're taking this survey online or something like that. There's not really anybody to scrunch their face up or raise an eyebrow at you. But the reality is that people kind of fall into two categories. So one is people who don't believe that their beliefs are conspiratorial whatsoever, and they're just obviously right. And it's everybody else that has the problem. And then the sort of true believers, there's sort of this air of sophistication to knowing that you saw through the fog, right? And you know what's actually going on. So they actually like to tell us what they believe, even though they know that you know, we might think that it's wrong, or, you know, these ideas are pretty dubious or something along those lines.
So it's not embarrassing for people and you can use public opinion protocols to find a representative sample that would include a certain percentage of people who will freely admit to things, because why not?
That's right. I mean, so my research is always almost always, with the exception of some experimental frameworks, on nationally representative samples of people. So that's kind of an important point, actually, because you know, I don't like that term conspiracy theorist very much, but part of the reason for that is it also sort of smacks of like fringe, right? So I don't actually study fringe beliefs. I study beliefs that a lot of people have. So to the extent that there's something called social desirability bias happening, where people don't want to tell us what they actually believe for fear of some kind of social judgment, kind of like I was discussing earlier. To the extent that that's true, then we're underestimating something that we have a ton of evidence for already, right? So, you know, coronavirus conspiracy theories, if we're underestimating, then I don't know, 30% is the floor. That still seems pretty troubling to me. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there's too big of a problem with that sort of thing.
Well, let's talk first pre-corona. What are some fringe or versus conspiracy types of studies that you've done in your previous research and then go specifically into the COVID-19 conspiracy theories. So what would make something fringe versus conspiracy? What are some examples that you've done in your prior research? And then how does this fit today?
Well, I don't think that there are fringe conspiracy theories. I think that there are conspiracy theories that are weaponized by fringe groups toward, I don't know, I guess we could say particularly evil ends. So, white supremacist kinds of groups might they tend to use these sort of conspiratorial narratives of various sorts that fall somewhere between conspiracies and populism and end times kind of narratives and what we call Manichaean narratives, which is dichotomizing everything into good versus evil. So that could be conspiracy theories about racial groups is usually a big one. So the New York Times just ran a story maybe a week ago about the Boogaloo, which is this sort of race war that's supposedly coming down the pike. And then, of course, other kinds of religious groups and low status groups of various sorts. So Jews are regularly the target of conspiracy theories, and especially among radical kind of fringe groups that have racial motivations. My earlier work is mostly centered on determining the antecedents of conspiracy beliefs. So I don't just really want to understand the levels of conspiracy beliefs and say X number of people believe this or something along those lines. I'm interested in why people believe those things. Okay? So my previous work's all about sort of uncovering that and providing some nuance to how we understand that. So some of the other research that's kind of in this area is about correcting these kinds of beliefs or correcting misinformation. Those people care a little bit less about why people believe certain things, and they're all sort of just looking for a patch, right? Historians obviously are interested in looking at how conspiracy theories sort of evolve over time and which ones have sort of stuck around for hundreds of years and those kinds of things. So I'm interested in the antecedents that usually come in political, psychological, and social forms. And there's really nothing special if you think about it in that framework with coronavirus conspiracy theories that kind of fit the typology of just about anything else. Those same kinds of political and psychological motivations are behind coronavirus conspiracy theories. So that's kind of where we're at now.
So it sounds like you study the mind and how and why a mind is primed to take in information. Right. And believe a conspiracy. So before we get to other questions, let's finish this part because I think that it's very interesting. What kind of mind is primed to listen and to believe a conspiracy theory?
A very regular and run-of-the-mill and uninteresting mind, just like the ones that everybody here has. So political motivations. We talk about this thing called motivated reasoning. We have, this sort of tribalistic, in terms of partisanship and ideological identities kind of political landscape that people are navigating. And even though we don't feel super attached to in-groups all the time, we definitely don't like out-groups, right? So we might turn to conspiracy theories that sort of malign the out-group, that do some harm to their reputation, that might end up hurting them at the polls because that's good for us. We might turn to conspiracy theories that elites that are on our side are sort of trafficking in. So, this is a long-standing sort of finding and theory in political science research. People tend to follow the leaders, and elites kind of, they construct the spectacle of politics. They put parameters on how we think and what we're talking about through framing and priming and agenda setting and rhetoric in general. So we tend to listen to these people, and it's not all respect, but it's mostly that sort of shared partisan bond. So those are sort of some of the political reasons why we might turn to these things. Psychologically, a number of different psychological biases is, I think, the best way to think about it, that might lead us to turn to a conspiracy theory that might make conspiracy theories attractive to us because they're sort of satisfying some psychological goal or relieving some tension or pressure. So some examples. One is people do really, really badly with uncertainty. Okay? We don't like that the world is unpredictable. We want to know what's going to happen. If we're thinking about coronavirus, we want to know that this is going to be okay. We wish that public health officials actually had, some answers for us, which there are much more questions than answers, right? And this uncertainty, some people are sort of naturally predisposed to be able to deal with it a little bit better than others, but especially in current times, when we have this pandemic that has everybody freaked out and it's all we're paying attention to, that uncertainty is more salient for all of us, and it's making everybody a little bit more anxious. So how does a conspiracy theory help if you're feeling the pressures of uncertainty? Well, it imposes some structure on the world, okay? So it says, this isn't just a random thing that happened that could happen to anybody, right? And, these viruses just happen, and sometimes we have pandemics, and therefore we could have another one in a year, we could have another one in 10 years, and nobody really knows. It's completely sort of uncertain. By imposing some structure on this, we get a little bit of control back. We relieve a little bit of anxiety because we know, well, somebody did this to us, right? This is a Chinese bioweapon. They did this to us. If they weren't around, this wouldn't have happened. And because it's a bioweapon, maybe there's a vaccine already. Maybe there's an antidote or something like that. If we think that the threat of coronavirus is being strategically exaggerated by Democrats to hurt President Trump's reelection plans or something like that, then that makes us feel a little bit better because it's not actually that bad, right? There are other things going on and everything's going to be okay. So especially when it comes to feeling a little bit powerless, a little bit helpless, uncertain, and the anxiety that stems from those things, conspiracy theories can provide some sort of subconscious psychological relief. So another key point is this is not a psychological, a conscious thing where we say, well, I'm not feeling well today, so I'll search the dark web for something weird to believe and feel better. It's the subconscious motivations that make these weird explanations for the world attractive to us.
That's a very intriguing answer, and I'm tempted to go and veer into a new direction. Very briefly, it sounds like the typical person who's primed for these beliefs is also smart and politically attuned, meaning having a basic literacy of the key players. And if you go into some of these conspiracies, let's say some of the ones that surrounded Hillary Clinton and the conspiracies that ultimately went to the nearly tragic shooting at Comet Pizza, that you actually have to have quite a bit of intellect to follow them closely and put the pieces of the puzzle together. So is there also an intellectual side, almost a hobbyist side, that includes high levels of political knowledge?
Yeah, I think there's a hobbyist side. I think on the one hand, I don't want to pin conspiracy beliefs on sort of political extremists solely. That is to say, people that are, really strong Democrats aren't necessarily more likely to be, conspiratorial than your run-of-the-mill Democrat. But like many other things in politics and in political behavior, the people that are sort of in the center, the moderates, the independents, the thing about them is they don't really care about politics, right? They don't pay attention. They vote at the lowest rates. So those are not the people that are sort of paying attention, and they're not the people that are being exposed to these things, therefore, because they're not listening to the news. They're not looking for conspiracy theories that malign the Clintons on 4chan or something like that. They're just doing other things. So yeah, you definitely need to be sort of paying attention to politics and be invested in politics, at least when it comes to conspiracy theories that have been adopted by a political party or visible political elites, or that sort of impugn particular elites or particular parties. On the hobbyist end, I'll say that an intellect that doesn't have to do with politics necessarily. There's this great line in this documentary on Netflix called, I think it's called Behind the Curve, which is about flat earthers. And it's actually a really nicely done documentary, in my opinion. All these flat earth people are setting up these really sophisticated experiments to try and prove that the earth is flat. And at some point they're interviewing a physicist that I think is at the University of Georgia or something like that. And the interviewers describe this experiment, and he sort of sits back and thinks to himself and says, that actually seems very reasonable to me. And if they had evidence for their hypothesis at the end, then I would take it, but it's gonna fail. And it did. So a lot of these people are actually, they're very smart, right? They almost could have been really good scientists if we just sort of like got to them before they started making these other kinds of connections and that sort of thing. So there is this, I don't know, at least like in the center of the people that are really high in conspiratorial thinking, they probably have this natural sort of scientific proclivities to some extent, but also are definitely bought into politics.
That's very interesting. So a lot of people, maybe I and other casual observers, would blame the internet and social media for fanning the flames or even causing some of these inclinations because there are sort of, quote, new troves of information out there that are a lot easier to find than, say, what a Kennedy conspiracist or the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorists had to go to the library and do a lot of legwork and find obscure photographs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's much easier for all of us to engage in this. But you and I have spoken about this before, and you can't blame the internet and social media. So let's talk about how these new sources of information have and have not impacted these trends.
Yeah, so first I'll say that the internet and social media platforms definitely facilitate the spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation and other kinds of dubious ideas that aren't as benign as we wish they were. But that is really, I think, to miss the point of conspiracy theories and misinformation, and that's to misunderstand where they come from, which I think holds all the answers for corrections, right? So in my view, and lots of other people's view, conspiracy theories literally go back to the beginning of time. People have always had these same kinds of psychological needs. They're not really, we're not all that different today, at least according to evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists, than we were 1,000 years ago. So we're always looking to impose some structure on the world. We're always a little bit uncomfortable with random and uncertain, and we're always feeling a little bit powerless, and we have our groups that we care about, and those are all the basic ingredients that we really need for these kinds of explanations. We can, blaming communication technology is silly, and we should probably have learned from past mistakes at this point. So we burned books when we blamed those in trafficking with bad ideas or socially harmful ideas or whatever. We blamed television, we blamed radio before, we blamed rock music, especially if you play it backwards, we blamed board games, whatever, right? So, conspiracy theories are really sort of a natural product of the human condition, I think. So blaming the internet is just not particularly useful, although it definitely makes things a little bit worse.
That's really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to get to some questions regarding that. Just to wrap up this portion, this is a very short question, and then we're going to get to some of the pre-submitted ones. How do you distill research and your approaches, as sophisticated as they are, to an introduction to American government and politics class? So let's bring it back down to the student level. It's hard to be a researcher in front of introductory classes, but you have to give them some of this information. So how do you weave this into a first-year class? And what are some of your favorite topics and assignments to get students to think more analytically about politics?
So in especially the intro level classes, I do a lot of debunking and a lot of application, right? So I don't know, one of my favorite things to do, maybe this is like some sort of like contrarian roots in my brain or something, is to, take something that, people tend to believe or think they all know, and then show them that that's wrong, and then sort of rebuild up from there. So examples of that, we usually start off a class talking about all of these these things that we think we know about American history that are probably wrong, or that we've seen through rose-tinted glasses. I like to look at excerpts from this a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen, who's, he did a lot of work on the sort of whitewashing of history. So that's where things kind of start. And I like to spend a lot of time also on rights and liberties, because obviously fundamental to American democracy, but people tend not to know what the rights are, or how the best way to sort of think about the Bill of Rights and those kinds of things, which are incidentally pretty important when we're looking at all these protests that are happening, and people that are sort of armed reopening businesses in this sort of particular political climate and amid the pandemic. So lots of sort of debunking what people thought they knew and returning to that, but also lots of application. So tons of returning to earlier content, and we're looking at developments in Supreme Court cases and lots of other kinds of institutional stuff.
Okay. So let's get to some questions. I'm looking at the chat, and I looked at some of our pre-submitted questions, and a lot of people are concerned about how to stop the spread of conspiracy theories. So can you talk about the average person getting a Facebook post from a relative, and how do you combat that at a personal level, but also for leaders? And this goes into some of your new pieces that you published in the Washington Post and the Atlantic. So tell us first about the regular person to stop a conspiracy from spreading, and then how would leaders also engage in that behavior?
Okay, so I'll give a notoriously long-winded answer that basically degenerates down to we don't really know. So what can you do if somebody, like this happened to me, for instance, shared, in fact, I had 3 people in my family send me the link to the Plandemic video the night before it was removed from most platforms, at least YouTube and Vimeo and Facebook. What do you say to that person other than, or do you ignore them, or what? The most important thing, I think, is what we know is what not to do. Okay, so don't tell that person that they're an idiot. Don't make them feel like they're trafficking in misinformation, or that they're stupid, or that they're just partisan hacks or something along those lines. That's definitely what you don't want to do, especially if it's somebody whose relationship you value. What you should do is feel out to what extent they might be willing to actually think about this with you. And that's an important first step, because a lot of people are just not going to change their mind. They're just not. So you need to sort of suss out whether they're even willing to give that a shot in the first place. So it might start with something like, can you tell me like where you got this? Or sympathetic tones are nice. So maybe something along the lines of, yeah, this is all sort of freaking me out too. There's all this misinformation. We're not really sure what to believe. This happens to me all the time. So, what's this thing that you sent me, and where is it from, and what do you think, do you think it's right? One of my colleagues always says, I'm going to steal this from him. If you ask somebody their source of information and they have to tell you out loud, it's something like conservativeeaglenewspunch.com, that the hope is that maybe they feel a little bit silly saying that out loud, and you can kind of point out, maybe that's not the best information. There aren't really any sort of experts sourced there, and something along those lines. So striking a sympathetic tone, trying to identify with what they're feeling, and then trying to sort of break it down for them without being quite so aggressive with it, right? Having them sort of break it down themselves and see some of the error in that reasoning. But this is really hard to do because a lot of people that, you know, are on conservative-newspunch.com and believe that, you know, there's a deep state where politicians and other members of the bureaucracy are abusing children and whatever, they're gone probably. So you might just have to sort of wish them well and walk away.
That's very good advice. And quickly, for the leaders of the country, including possibly presidential candidates or other political figures on both sides, do they have a role to play in stopping their own followers, or just in general steering us toward information?
In a sense, the solution is easy. It's just don't do that, right? Don't mimic these things. Don't cue these kinds of beliefs. Don't say this is the Democrats' new hoax or anything along those lines. Just not trafficking in conspiracy beliefs and misinformation from the top could really do a lot, because a lot of this really is top down. Most people are not on 4chan and 8chan. Most people aren't on Reddit, right? So, you know, there is this sort of dark web where these things definitely sort of run rampant, but that's so few people, right? The bigger concern is the regular people that hear these kinds of things on the nightly news.
One of the chat questions earlier asked, how many Americans believe in conspiracy theories at any given time, and is it even possible to make a general guess?
The last study that we did, which was fielded March 17th to the 19th, 2020, we polled on 22 different conspiracy theories, and only 9% of people didn't express some level of belief in any of them.
Okay.
So I don't want to say that it's 90% of people believe conspiracy theories. The more you poll on them, you know, and the more sort of they vary in characteristics. Some are about science and health and medicine, and some are sort of purely political and about political groups. You know, the greater sort of variety you have, the more you're going to find that people maybe not are true believers, but say, I don't know, maybe there's something to that. You know, I'm not going to sort of wholesale reject this.
Is there a way, and this is another chat question, to do any type of generalization in the socioeconomic, cultural, educated range? Is there a group profile? Because you mentioned some of the psychological needs on an individual level. Can we expand any generalizations there?
Sort of socio-demographically.
Race, gender, socioeconomic status, cultural,
I'll
other
just
cultural opinions, yeah.
low status, right?
Low
Status. So this could be low socioeconomic status. This could be racial minority groups that, you know, have a history of being discriminated against. Gender, not quite so much. In terms of specific conspiracy theories that are targeting whole genders, just because that's probably not going to work when you're 50-50-ish. Why among low status groups? Because again, conspiracy theories are attractive to people who feel powerless, right? They feel helpless. So imagine working your tail off to try and get wherever you're trying to go in life and just never being able to get there, right? That's not actually very conspiratorial at all, right? We have all kinds of systemic issues that prevent people, certain people from doing that. But it might cause one to say, look, there has to be this conspiracy that's sort of keeping me down, that's keeping this foot on my neck. And also with low status groups, when it comes to religion and racial and ethnic groups, some of those people, you know, there's lots of good reason to expect that a conspiracy is afoot when bad things have actually happened in the past. So an example of this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that were done on African American males. Most of them weren't actually treated for syphilis, and they gave it to their partners and they died. So in the African American community, you look at things like that and say, well, AIDS must be population control for us, or contraception, because look at this, the government actually did this before and it experimented with people and so on and so forth.
So a few other chat questions relate to the algorithms that a lot of social media platforms use to direct consumers. And as our colleague Jason Gaines has said in his own research, these algorithms are not necessarily for bad purposes. They're just trying to make money for the company by giving you what they think you want so that you keep coming back and looking at the ads. So that in itself is not a conspiracy. That is an economic model for a business. But nevertheless, some of these questions are, could these platforms do more to steer people back rather than steer them toward these beliefs?
I imagine they could. I don't know if they have an incentive to, because if you're still clicking at the end of the day, then the algorithm works, right? It serves its purpose. So you end up with these filter bubbles, or selective exposure is sometimes called, where people keep kind of getting re-exposed to the same kinds of information from the same people. Regulating that, I think, is pretty challenging. I don't think there's a ton of support for regulating that.
So there would be censorship, really, is what one of the chat comments said. It's tricky.
Yeah, the best way to mitigate beliefs in conspiracy theories and misinformation is to not have people exposed to them in the first place. And that has all sorts of problems associated with it, obviously, in a country that champions, First Amendment.
Okay. This is a strange question, but it did come up earlier with one of our pre-submitted questions. Do you have a favorite conspiracy theory to study? And what would make it your favorite in that? What makes it more intellectually or research oriented and researchable?
I think I'd probably go back to the flat Earth. We don't actually pull on that very much, but flat Earth is interesting because it is, no pun intended, a very multidimensional conspiracy theory, right? There are some people that believe in that because it's just part of like a social identity. They're just sort of outcasts, and this is sort of almost like a fandom kind of thing for them, where they get together at conferences, and they sort of interact with each other on the premise of believing in flat Earth, but it kind of just degenerates into regular.
Maybe I'm ignorant, but I don't understand, what is the benefit of believing in flat Earth? What are you uncovering?
Right.
Is it,
that's the thing.
Well, what is the guiding force of that type of physical conspiracy? A conspiracy about nature, about the forces of nature, about how we're taught about nature? What's the attraction?
Not nature. It's almost always some group of elites that's just pulling the wool over eyes for some reason or another. So flat earthers believe that the United Nations crest, which is actually sort of a cartoonization of something called an azimuthal projection map. It's kind of like if you took a globe of the US and then looked at the top and unpeeled it, that's kind of what it looks like. So you'd have this ring called Antarctica, right, around the perimeter of that. And they say, well, this is elites kind of like throwing this in our face. This is real. There's actually an ice wall that sort of encompasses us. The motive is a little bit less clear, which I think is what you were getting at, but it's always the elites are doing this to us for some reason or another. Maybe they believe that elites are able to actually travel off this planet or beyond the ice wall or something like that. There are all sorts of variants of flat Earth.
So one last question, then I'll turn it back to Marianne. If conspiracy theories are more prevalent in lower SES or socioeconomic status groups, are there national differences then that are studyable between countries who have relatively higher or lower SES clusters?
Well, what we've found so far, and we haven't polled every country or anything like that. But we've got a lot of polling in certainly Western democracies, a lot of Eastern European countries and some Asian countries. For the most part, the levels of that thing that I was referring to before, conspiratorial thinking, the sort of general predisposition, is about equal across countries. So it seems like the distribution of socioeconomic status probably doesn't have a ton to do with that, but people can believe in conspiracy theories for lots of different reasons again. So this isn't to say that there aren't, 80% of people that believe in a particular conspiracy theory.
Right.
If you live in, I don't know, some sort of totalitarian government that actually does all of these bad things to their people and regularly lies about things. So that could be the case. But this general predisposition doesn't seem to be distributed differently across countries.
Okay. Well, let's take a pause right here, and I'll let Marianne come back. And Adam, is there anything that has come back to you from an earlier question that you'd like to revisit? I'm looking at the chat, and maybe Marianne and Amanda can as well. I think we covered a lot of these questions, maybe not perfectly, but Marianne, what would you like to bring us back to in our last few minutes?
So one question that I just want to throw out there, both personally and from anecdotally, I guess, from my interactions with alumni, is that they're always craving that lifelong learning aspect. And one thing I missed after finishing both my undergraduate and my graduate degrees was good book recommendations. What do I read now? I've been told what to read for so long. What do I read now? So from both of you, obviously your own books, and we'll make sure that people get links to those titles. But what are some book recommendations that you have for people who are interested in your particular areas of study?
I'll let Adam answer that, but we also have one final question in the chat, Adam, that you can do before or after that, which is about tying psychological predispositions toward paranoia, and if there's any connection there. So you answer Marianne's question, and then that question, I think that will be the end of it.
Okay. Book recommendations, I think the best, so the empirical study of conspiracy theories is actually pretty new. Historians have touched on this and philosophers have touched on this a little bit over time, but really modern sort of sociology and communication and political science and psychology, most of it starts in the early aughts. So the book that I think is the very best is called Conspiracy Theories and Those Who Believe Them. And that's an edited volume by Joe Usinski, co-author of mine. And it's pretty thick, and it has essays from all people who work in all social scientific disciplines. So getting back to one of Jasmine's earlier questions about, interdisciplinarity and borrowing, it's a great volume because it has all these different perspectives on the same thing. The question was about, what again? Oh, paranoia. Yeah, so paranoia and belief in sort of superstitious beliefs are correlated with conspiratorial thinking, but we shouldn't think of them as quite the same. So those things might make one more willing to believe in things that they can't see, if we're thinking about superstition, right? Or paranoia, I guess, sort of gets at the, there's a puppet master out there sort of deal. But those labels come with some baggage, again, kind of like conspiracy theorists. So I want to sort of emphasize that by mere fact of there being a correlation between all those things, it's not, again, that people who believe in conspiracy theories are crazy, right? Just like we would say that most people, people who believe in ghosts, ghosts or angels or God aren't necessarily crazy, right?
Right. But it's the narrative part. So perhaps bringing back the narcissism that somebody mentioned earlier, as well as paranoia, is it possible that for people who are serious hobbyists, they have a heroic narrative of themselves, piecing this together and sharing this information to stop evildoers as they see them? And the story is really a personal one, not just about making sense of the world, but making sense of my own place in the world by figuring this out. So for example, the famous one about child pornography, CP, Comet Pizza, seeing patterns where there are no patterns, but again, detecting something to save others.
Right.
Is there a savior part of this as well?
Yeah, I think there's a hero complex.
Yes.
There's not a ton of research on that, but conspiracy beliefs are and conspiratorial thinking are correlated with this thing in psychology that they call the dark triad, which is kind of about egotism and disagreeableness, but the specific dimensions are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. So people that, Machiavellianism is sort of like using flattery to get your way. I think narcissism is the most reasonable of those because it's all about, I've figured this out. I'm the smartest person in the room, that sort of thing.